It is a parody of democracy. Many millions of Syrians will be unable to participate in such a so-called election, and we call on the entire international community to reject these illegitimate elections.
Britain's Foreign Secretary William Hague condemning the presidential election in Syria. During the Friends of Syria meeting last month in London, the United Kingdom, the United States and Arab countries vowed to step up assistance to Syria's moderate opposition. Welcome back. Joining us now is Daoud Khairallah, a law professor with Georgetown University, and Mohammed Alaa Ghanem, Director of Government Relations for the Syrian American Council in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us. There we heard the British Foreign Secretary call these elections a parody of democracy, illegitimate. Daoud, I guess the point is, how can you have elections in a country in the midst of a civil war?
Well, I don't know whether this civil war is totally a Syrian creation and a Syrian practice. The uprising, the purposes of the uprising have been eclipsed by resorting to weapons. And the resort to weapons made it necessary for the Syrians to rely on foreign forces for the supply of weapons, money, training, and everything else. And this has led to the destruction of Syria. So what has been going on for the last 3 years was a systemic destruction of the Syrian nation and some kind of dismantling of the social fabric when they resorted, in addition to the foreign intervention and resort to force, to inciting sectarian feelings, which was meant to dismantle the social fabric. So this was taking place, and this has been taking place continuously. The outside forces have eclipsed the purposes of the uprising, and they focus on one issue, and that is the legitimacy of the Assad regime, that is, should say, of Bashar al-Assad personally.
All right, Mohammed, let me get your response to that.
Well, the short answer is you can't. That's why Syrian activists have billed these elections as quote-unquote blood elections. Elections are about choice. It's about giving people the right to choose. And people in Syria are robbed of that right. They can't exercise that right. A friend of Damascus I reached out to yesterday about his opinion about what's happening in his hometown, and he lives in central Damascus, had the following to say. He said, I was walking down the street, a security officer stops me, and he says, why haven't you voted? And my friend, because he was intimidated, said, well, I'm headed to the election center right now. So they go there, and he had to vote for Assad. And then he said, I had to vote 6 times in 6 different polling stations in the same neighborhood where he lives, in central Damascus, in Mezzeh. So this is the kind of elections that's taking place right now in Syria. Turnout was very low. It was only held in some regime-controlled areas, in some neighborhoods, rebel-held territory, no polling centers there. And of course, millions of people are in refugee camps, about 3 million. About 9 million are internally displaced. So that's why we believe it's a travesty of democracy, it's a parody of democracy, it's a sham election.
Daoud, the United Nations has urged President Assad not to have these elections right now, saying that they will not be legitimate if he goes ahead and does so. Why is he so intent on having elections right now? Is he trying to get some veneer of legitimacy in Syria?
I don't know whether it's a veneer or it is showing the reality. At the end of the day, it will be the number of people, the percentage of eligible people who will go to the voting booth and prove the United Nations whether it is a charade, whether it is an issue.
Okay, let's look at one figure.
By the way, Joseph Stalin said it's not about people counting, casting the votes, it's about people counting the votes. Right. They are the ones who decide everything.
Okay, but let's look at one figure here. 2 million people displaced in Syria. They're also refugees. These are potential voters. They're not going to be able to vote.
Well, it's probably true. And not only that, there are people who are under the control of the armed opposition who are not allowed to go to vote. And the armed opposition has threatened those who will vote. And some countries who are among the friends of Syria have not allowed Syrians to vote in their own country. So the issue, when you look at people who are outside, who are in Lebanon, who are in Jordan, and the masses they went to the Syrian embassies to vote, you would have a different idea than what is being spread in the West.
Well, in fact, a large coalition of armed opposition groups 2 days ago issued a statement and went on the record saying that they will not be targeting people going to the polls and that they will hold their fires because, quote, they believe that people are being led, are led to this election. So I would wholeheartedly disagree with his assessment. And again, I'm from Damascus. I am Syrian. I reach out to folks there. Anne Bernard, New York Times, she ran into a guy in Damascus, and he said that he voted 5 times and that his 12-year-old son also voted. So again, this is what's happening right now in Syria. It's not 2 million people internally displaced, it's 9.5 million people internally displaced and 3 million people externally displaced. So to call this election, I think, is an insult to democracy.
Okay, let's look at what has been going on in the war itself. I want you to listen to something a professor from the American University in Beirut, his name is Hilal Kashan. This is what he had to say about the civil war and the uprising, and he is talking here about Assad. Let's listen.
He seems to have succeeded in diverting the course of the uprising. Many people now have come to think, many Syrians especially, have come to think that Assad's stay in power might be better than the terror of radical Islamic groups.
Daoud, to some extent, battlefield conditions have changed. There's been a big development in the last few weeks with the government retaking the city of Homs, rebels leaving that city. So to what extent do you believe that people might have just now resigned themselves to the fact that Assad's here to stay, we're going to have to deal with him?
Well, when they look at what they have, Assad, no matter how he was portrayed, and he continues to be portrayed by people who don't want him there, and the opposition, the alternative, when they see Daesh and Nusra and people who cut the throat and cut the and eat the heart and whatever, and see that this is the future, this is the alternative, this definitely would make Syrian people think of some kind of order under this terrible regime that they have been under for so long. So the reality on the ground at the end of the day would prove itself, would impose itself. No matter what it is being said about the election, how they rigged they are, and how many people voted 20 times, and his mother told him that whatever her little son has done, all these things would not bear truth when we know the reality on the ground and when we see what is in the best interest of the Syrian people. And what has happened, in my judgment, is that the Syrians have realized that during the last 3 years, the reform was not at stake. And the only thing that was taking place was the systemic destruction of their country. And they felt that this regime is some kind of security to maintain the nation together.
By the way, I do concur with that last bit. I do believe that the country over the past 3 years has been systematically destroyed by the Assad regime, decisive intervention from Hezbollah and Iran. And of course, as you know, Iran right now is recruiting foreign fighters to fight on behalf of the Assad regime, even from among the Afghani refugee population in Iran. So back to your point about terrorists. Assad is a magnet of terror. Assad is the reason why terrorists are flooding into the country. He released terrorists from his prisons, the same terrorists he sent to Iraq in the past. He released them from prison in order to create these terror groups and legitimize and validate his narrative. So long as Assad is in power, there will be groups fighting against Assad, and this country will never see stability. The only way forward is for Assad to step down and for a political transition to be ushered in. So the moderate opposition, the moderate Syrian opposition, is the only party to the conflict in Syria that's fighting extremists.
To what extent?
The Assad regime is not fighting Islamic State of Iraq and Sham that he talked about. He is buying oil from them. He is supporting them and empowering them financially.
Right, but Mohammed, to what extent has that moderate opposition been hijacked by extremist elements who are the ones making the headlines right now?
Well, if it had not been for the moderate opposition back in January, I think, yes, the extremist opposition would have now established control all across northern Syria. So the moderate opposition right now is fighting a two-front war against the Assad regime and against the extremists, and that's why we support them. And again, he's saying that Syrians realized that so-and-so, I'm Syrian, and I'm not sure I came to these conclusions. I completely disagree with this assessment. Well,
the point is, Daoud, is that Syria has been a dictatorship, still is a dictatorship. I mean, it's only now that we're seeing on the ballot paper another name rather than the Assad name. It's always been the Assad name on all ballot papers.
Well, the issue is that even if it were only the Assad or that opposition, that armed opposition, then the people who went and voted so massively for Assad, they refused the alternative. And the moderate opposition is a little bit of a fiction on the ground. I don't know what is meant by moderate, and all those, the Qaeda derivatives, most of them, or all of them, have some Islamic fundamentalist motivation with the same understanding of democracy, the same understanding of human rights, women's rights, fighting corruption. And the real sponsors of the Syrian opposition now, this armed opposition, are beacons of democracy in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others. I mean, when one is Syrian citizen, a free citizen, not attached to here or there, would look at his country and would see who is supporting this opposition, cannot but conclude that the alternative is.
Can I just say something? Yeah, sure. First of all, the turnout was extremely low. It was in some neighborhoods in Damascus, Maliki, Abu Romani, Mazeh, some neighborhoods in Homs, and that was, and some Tartus, some Latakia, and that was pretty much it. We're talking about a country of 23 million people, so I'm not sure about the massive, quote-unquote, massive turnout. And it all happened after, everything happened after, under watchful eyes by the 17 different security police, secret police formations that we have in Syria. So I'm not sure about
I want to get your views very quickly. We're running out of time. We've only got a minute left. Why has the West been so reluctant, so reticent to come to the aid of the opposition in Syria when they initially said, yes, we want Bashar al-Assad to step down?
Well, I think the United States in particular has been reluctant because you know, they're emerging from a decade of wars. There's war fatigue, they're war weary, they're war wary. They think this might turn into another Iraq. They think that this might require boots on the ground at some point in the future. It might become an open-ended commitment. And of course, the Syrian opposition is saying, we don't need boots on the ground. This is not what we're asking for. It's not a fair fight. There's decisive intervention by Hezbollah and Iran and unfettered access to weaponry from Russia. So what is needed is just robust support to carefully vetted elements of the moderate opposition so they can continue to fight these two wars against extremists and against the Assad regime. Keep in mind, if it were not for the moderate opposition in Syria, the extremists would be in control. Assad is buying oil from them. They're in control of some oil wells. He's empowering them financially. He needs them. So that's why the moderate opposition is Syria's only hope for a future that's inclusive for all.
Okay, I want to get your quick response to why the West has not been involved. President Obama did allude to some kind of assistance. He wasn't very specific in his speech he made at West Point. He said, we have not abandoned the Syrian people. We will still help them. But it doesn't seem that there's going to be any kind of material, you know, help in terms of weapons, in terms of strategic assistance.
Well, I think Mr. Obama and his aides realize that the moderate Syrian opposition is pretty much of a fiction. And they know that on the ground, the people who are holding the ground are the fundamentalists, and they fear the hatching of terrorism that would come to bite anyone who would support them eventually. I mean, the Afghanistan experience is still alive, and Al-Qaeda is more prominent now than it has ever been prominent. And the intervention in Syria, those who have intervened to foment the strife in Syria,
Secretary John Kerry said, I think, you know, our U.S. officials have been saying the exact opposite. Secretary John Kerry said that Assad is a magnet of terror. The Obama administration will be working with the moderate opposition on a select scale because they believe they're the only ones fighting the extremes.
We are going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you to both of you for joining us.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And you can now listen to CCTV America programs 24/7 from anywhere in the United States by simply calling 231-460-1199. I'm Anand Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.